This is the National Jazz Museum in Harlem's Harlem Speak series, in which we talk with very important people in the jazz world from a variety of perspectives. And we are absolutely thrilled to have one of the great veterans here, a man who has seen it all, played it all, and is a legend. Welcome, George Freeman. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. This is a pleasure.
Well,
it's so different. My goodness.
And I'm joined here by Ted Pankin, wonderful jazz writer and historian who has done a lot at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, all the major publications, and specifically knows a lot about music in Chicago. And I know you interviewed and did a lot of things actually with George's brother, Von Freeman.
It's true, right. I did.
So we have a wonderful context here. George, I'd just like to begin with the basic facts. You tell us where and when you were born.
Well, I was born here in Chicago at 4915 Champlain, here in Chicago, Illinois. Mm-hmm. And I was here, and my mother and father was a policeman, and my mother was a church lady. So my father, he used to, by being a policeman, he had to work 2 or 3 different shifts. And he worked that shift from 12 to 8 o'clock in the morning. And worked 8 to 4 and 4 to 5. But when he worked that late shift, we had a radio called the Majestic Radio. And he had tuned that radio up in a way where you could hear the bass on it very well. But at that time, he would tune in Fat Wallace and Duke, Gene Krupa, Anita O'Day, I remember her, and Fat Wallace, I remember him, Cowboy. And my father had the pleasure of meeting lots of those great artists when they come to town, because they would come to this place in Chicago, and my father, Beat was down there, so he would bring by the house Fat Wallace and all of the great cats, because he wanted them to meet his sons. But anyway, when he worked that night shift, he turned that radio on, and that's all I could hear was jazz. Go to bed hearing jazz, wake up in the morning hearing jazz. My mother, she'd be singing spirituals. My father was singing like Bing Crosby.
Let me ask you a question, George. How was it that your folks wound up in Chicago? How did the Freeman family come to Chicago?
Well, my mother's from Cincinnati, really, and my father's from Atlanta, Georgia. And we all were born, the brothers, we all were born here in Chicago. This is our home here in Chicago. So basically, we were raised in Chicago and raised at, I went to Birch School, elementary school, and Bruz and Von went to Willard High School. And we all ended up at DuSable High School. DuSable High School was where all the great jazz musicians came out of. So we were able to, Walter died, and he had a concert band, and he had a booster band. Well, the booster band was very important because the booster band was all jazz. And he would have jazz, and when Walter died, first got to DuSable High School, he was teaching the kids how to play jazz. But the kids were unruly. The kids didn't know how to act. The kids act trouble. And Walter died, couldn't do anything with the kids. So Walter died, went to Winter Phillips, it's another school there, went to Phillips High School. He went over there and told the rector over there, he said, I can't make these kids mine. So the director said, well, come to my school and sit down for a minute, and I'll show you how to handle these kids. So Walter Dad went over to the school and sat down and watched this director there at one of the Phillips, and he was directing the band with a 45. Can you hear me?
Okay, with a 45.
We're just absorbing that.
He was directing the band with a 45, and every now and then he shoot at the tuba player, hit that tuba, and that bullet would ring all over the place. So Walter Dad said, I got to do all that. He said, that's how you handle these kids. And that's how Walter Dad became professionally a disciplinarian.
Yeah.
He knew how to handle the kids. And by that way, we had all those great musicians coming out of Chicago. And Benny Green, Johnny Griffin, Gene Ammons, Louis Jordan, and Johnny Griffin, I mentioned him. Mm-hmm. And so that's how that happened there. So
before we get into more about Diet and the great bands there, I'd like to go back just a little there and talk about how the guitar first came into your hands. How did that happen?
You never would believe this story, but I have to tell it. You can always erase it. We were young kids in the neighborhood on 54th and Kenya Drive, and they had a Rum Boogie Cafe there on 55th and Garfield, and all the Charlie Parker worked there at one time. All the big bands worked there, but anyway, we used to go back there, and they had course girls. See, back there in that time, they had course girls in the clubs. And so we'd go back there to watch the course girls. And the course girls would be in the back room. So we'd watch the course girls in the back room, and they let me fall. When I fell down, I didn't particularly like going back there no more. So we went back there. Come on, George, you got to go back there and watch the girls. I said, no. Last time I went back there, you all let me fall. So I went back there with him and heard a guitar player. And so I went to the side door, and I looked in the side door, and it was a guitar player with the guitar behind his neck. And he was playing Stormy Money Blues. And I said, who in the world is that? You know, and so it was T-Bone Walker. So, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. It was T-Bone Walker.
Yeah, T-Bone Walker is the one that turned me around. So at the meantime, my brothers were bringing home all the latest records by Gene Krupa, Tommy Dorsey, Artie Shaw, and mainly Benny Goodman, because he had a great sextet, and the sextet had a great guitarist in there named Charlie Parker. He's on my mind for some reason. Charlie Christian. So Charlie Christian I heard him, and that did it. He was the top guitarist at that time. Then he had Reinhardt. Reinhardt was over in Europe. Right. But Charlie Christian seemed to have he was more a martyr than Reinhardt. So everybody was trying to play like Charlie Christian. And I wasn't really trying to play like Charlie Christian because I was hearing horn players. Because my brother Vaughn played saxophone. And my brother eventually played the drums. But by me hearing that saxophone, that just turned me around because all the notes was rolling. At that time, they would roll those notes out. And at that time, horn players were howling and whooping and coming out on their knees. The saxophone players were something else. So I my brother Brian eventually he told me what to do and how to do it and gave me the concept.
Mhm.
In the meantime, I was listening to Charlie Christian, but Charlie Christian was so far ahead of his time. But the horn players were
Sure.
they they were quite different. They had they could play pretty ballads and they could swing and they could at that time you call it they were howling and hooping and screaming. It was guitar players didn't do that unless they were playing the blues.
Right.
But the horn players would stopping.
Yeah.
Lonnie Hampton's band was stopping when on their car, they were stopping and howling and screaming. And the drummers playing the backbeat.
Right.
The next thing I know, I was into the hardcore jazz.
Sure. I just like to pause there just for a moment and go back to the early days in Chicago. Just to start with, there were guitar players around Chicago. I believe George Barnes was in Chicago. Maybe we're frozen there.
Very familiar with George Barnes. In fact, I played some of his licks.
Could you talk about how you heard George Barnes?
I played some of his George. You said, have I ever heard him? Not in person.
I see. Now, King Colax was very big. I'm sorry, we have a little.
Oh, King.
One second, I think we have a little digital delay here. So let me just wait 1 second while things catch up here.
Okay.
I'm wondering if we could talk about some of the musicians who stayed in Chicago, not not your generation, but some of the older folks who were in Chicago at the time. Red Saunders, Zutty Singleton, people who were big shot, Albert Ammons, people who were in Chicago as you were very young. Did you run into any of those folks? I assume.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Yes, I did. I ran into. I was really a little bit too young at that time, but at that time, we had this radio in the house. And I remember Gene Krupa very well.
Right.
And Benny Goodman, and I remember Pat Wallace, and I remember they were, and Red, the trumpet player, I remember him. And of course, Louis Armstrong.
Right. Red Allen. Red Allen played in Chicago a lot.
Red Allen. That's what I'm trying to think of. Red Allen. I was crazy about Red Allen because he was a showman.
Roy Eldridge was in Chicago quite a bit too in the 30s.
I can't hear you.
Ted, can you come closer to your mic? You're very faint.
I was saying that Roy Eldridge also was in Chicago quite a bit in the 30s.
Roy Eldridge was the top man. He was with Gene Krupa. He was the top man on trumpet. One of the top men. He wasn't the top man. He was one of the top ones because he could swing so hard. Yeah, Roy Eldridge. Yeah, he was there.
When you were talking about Charlie Christian being so far ahead of his time, some people say that they hear some of Lester Young in Charlie Christian. Could you talk about the first time you became aware of Lester Young and his music?
Oh yeah. I played with Lester Young at the Persian Ballroom. In fact, I played one of his tunes, DB, on stage with him, and he looked at me like. He couldn't believe it. I played DB at the Persian Ballroom, Lester Young, DB, and the trombone player, Vic Dickerson. Played the whole 9 yards in front of Lester Young. And we made this record. And I played the first part of it. And Lester came in swinging. He was a swinger, no doubt about it. And definitely a swinger. So, oh yeah. I played with Lester, and I also played with Coleman Hawkins. But it was the difference in Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young, but they both swung hard. Coleman Hawkins played hard. and players swung hard. So that's the way I looked at it.
Yeah. Could
But
you
they
paint
were my
for,
favorite.
for us, since you knew these men and you shared the bandstand with them, for those of us who only know them through records and performances, can you paint a little bit of a picture of what they were like, what their personalities was like, what it was like playing for them? Because I assume you'd play for.
Yeah, well, Lester Young was totally. I know he dressed well, and he said play pretty and look pretty for the people, and that's what he did. Played some of the prettiest ballads in the world. Standards, yeah. He played mostly standards when he had his little group. He played all standards, and Coleman Hawkins he had a heavier tone, but Coleman Hawkins could also swing. They had two different styles of playing. Because my brother played like both of them, but I think he liked Coleman Hawkins more because Coleman Hawkins had a heavier sound, but he started out playing like Lester Young. See, at that time, all the horn players patterned themselves after Lester Young. Then he was playing like Coleman Hawkins. They were just the two top tenor players. And so that's what I was hearing. I was hearing nothing but tenor players until I heard Charlie Parker. And when I heard Charlie Parker, that was the end of that.
Right. What were
Charlie Parker turned me all.
What were the first professional bands that you played in when you actually started getting paid to play and out there playing gigs? Could you tell us who you played with and what the circumstances were very early on?
Can you say that again, please?
Sure. I was wondering if you could tell us about the first professional gigs you did, who you were playing with, what the gigs were, and who were some of the musicians besides your brothers that you were associated with early on.
Well, I played with a lot of. I went to New York City in 1947. I went there with Johnny Griffin. We left here. He was working with London Hampton's band, and he and on their cops. They were together in the group, and we went to. And he asked me to get him a group together, so I got a group together for him. And so we went to. Johnny went to New York City and went there with him in 1947. That was my first step into New York City. And it was exciting because we went there and we went to Harlem. We went to this club in Harlem called the Baby Grand. That was the job we were supposed to have had at that time. And so we walked inside the Baby Grand club, and he told the owner of the club, he says, well, we're here. And the man said, who's here? He says, well, I'm Joe Morris, and this is Johnny Griffin. He said, I never heard of you. That's my first adventure with New York. He said, I never heard of you. So Joe Morris said, well, we supposed to start here this weekend. He said, I don't know nothing about you. So we're in New York City. Joe Morris and Johnny Griffin just left Amsterdam. So we went to the Braddock Hotel. And that's where we ended up at the Braddock Hotel, and we stayed there. And we had Joe Morris had a couple of record dates. And I remember we recorded one of my tunes, which was the first hit for Atlantic label. It was called A Little Groovy. And we played at the Savoy Ballroom. At that time, the Savoy Ballroom was the kids come in there and they all would dance. And they had 3 bandstands there. The Savoy Ballroom was in Harlem. And so we worked there, and then we left there and went to Philadelphia. Well, we got to Philadelphia at the Zanzibar. That's when I met Philly Joe, Baxter Varl, and Howard McGee, Oh, it was quite exciting. Yeah, I met all the fellows in Festival, and he was top man, and of course, at that time they had 52nd Street, and that's where all the cats would come there to play on 52nd Street in New York. And by playing on 52nd Street, I would go down there. I've heard so much about New York, so when I got down there, it was Charlie Parker playing down there, and Charlie Parker and Miles Davis, and so I didn't know anything about Charlie Parker at the time. All I knew was that he had turned that thing so much around when we got to the Braddock Hotel, and that's all I could hear was Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Bud Powell, and Max Roach, and it was just exciting. And I was living in Harlem. The Braddock Hotel was in Harlem, so I was living in Harlem, and that's where everybody's coming in all around the world, coming to New York City because they wanted to play some of this bebop. And I didn't know Lester Young at the time, so when I finally met Lester Young, as I said before, I played DB in front of him. He thought I was out of my mind, but at that time I had a little groovy band, and we were playing for the kids, and the kids wanted to hear DB. And so when I got with Lester Young, they hired me to play with Lester Young, being a house band. So naturally, they wanted me to play DB, so I played DB for them. And I remember Lester coming behind me and swung that thing like I never heard before in my life. Then I worked there with Coleman Hawkins. I remember Coleman Hawkins telling me to blow. He said, blow. I was playing guitar, so he just told me to blow. At that time, we had lots of tenor players out there, though. But
speaking of Chicago, just for a moment, you mentioned tenor players, and I'm thinking of Tom Archie.
Archie, yeah.
Yeah.
Archie was a tenor player in Chicago. He and Gene Ammons. I never thought I ended up playing with him, but I ended up playing with him. But Tom Archie was a good tenor player, and he was here, and he upset Chicago, and he got some record dates. It was just, Chicago was really a tenor place, a saxophone town. It wasn't a guitar town. And so how I got in was playing like a saxophone. And that's what I like. I like saxophone. I didn't particularly care too much for guitars because most guitar players I heard at that time, they were playing like Charlie Clifton. But to me, the horn players were exciting. You know, at that time, they were jumping up and down and howling and whooping and screaming. And that just got to me.
Were there any piano players, maybe Chris Anderson and others in Chicago, that you were close with and that you talked or thought about harmony and chords with and comping and all those things? Did you have any partners to talk to about those things?
Well, I mostly talk, I really come up with Chris Anderson. I'm glad you mentioned him. He was unheard. Well, he was the hero in my day because he had beautiful voicings and he could play standards. See, at that time, standards that was the thing. You had to learn standards during that time. All the cats would come to town and they have a band there that would at this club there. There was Junior Manson. I remember him with Wilbur Campbell. They were sending musicians at the clubs there, and when the bands come to town, like Sonny Stitt, Gene Ammons, whatever, they had those standards, and tempo. They had to play fast. So
let's talk about Chris Anderson. because you went back so far with Chris, and you're one of the few people who can really tell us about him. And you both played chord instruments, so you were dealing with the changes and how to play behind someone. Can you tell us about your relationship with Chris and what it was that made him special, and any particular things about him? We would love to hear that.
But well, you know, he was blind. You know that. That was what amazed me. How he could be blind and play the way that he was playing, and how he could hear those standards. And everybody was playing. They weren't playing the chords that he was playing. Even Bud Powell was not playing that type of concept. He knew Bud was playing the instrument, but Chris Anderson was, and Art Tatum didn't have that concept either. Because Art Tatum he wasn't playing couldn't voice like Chris Anderson was quite different. He could voice them big, beautiful chords. And I remember him, and he was one of the top ones there. And as I said before, he was blind, but he sure could get over that piano.
How did you work it out? You know, it's always such a challenge for young players, especially when you have a guitar and a piano. And how did you work out things like that with who was comping and who was doing what? Were you both playing at the same time? Was it one would lay out and the other one wouldn't? Or was it just natural? How did you work things out with Chris?
Well, you know, when I was a kid going to DuSable, my mother, we moved from 58th in South Park to 59th in Kenyon Drive. I mean, 59th in Michigan. And when I got there, I met a guitar player who was a wizard. Now, this guitar player, he played similar to, well, he liked Charlie Christian, no doubt about that. But he taught me how to play the guitar on the low strings, the bottom strings, not the top strings, the low strings. And so, Chris, most piano players played up high, and most of them top up high. But this guitar player taught me how to comp on the lower strings, the last three strings. And I met another guitar player. He taught me how to play 4/4, like Freddie Green, how to keep the rhythm going. So therefore, I didn't have any trouble playing with piano players because I wasn't clashing with them because I was playing the lower strings, and most piano players are playing the upper strings. But when the piano player started playing the upper registers, well, I got to the point where I just lay out. I didn't want to get into that confusion with them, but so I played with organ players now. They tell me that they want me to play 4/4, Freddie Green, in which I learned how to do that. So, cause Freddie Green was he did 4/4, it's 4/4 all the time, and Chris Anderson had the concept of playing beautiful standards, but at that time, piano players were very important because they could well, what they had to do was you couldn't have a band at that time without a piano player, and he had to play for the singers and he had to play for the saxophone players. Singers couldn't play without him, and the guitar players, well, naturally they developed their own style of playing. They got guitar players. They play with their fingers and all kind of ways. So it's been a challenge.
I'm curious about like when you heard Charlie Parker and the bebop language came in, and in terms of comping, when the solos would go into the higher parts of the chord, you know, the plus 11s and the sharp 9s and the flat 9s, and start to deal up there. In terms of comping, did you try and comp more of the basic change and not chase what the soloist was doing and let them do the the other stuff, because it seems that in more recent years, the compers try and chase exactly what the horn player's doing, and there's no real contrast anymore, like the art to doing a basic comp and letting the soloist do the upper partials.
Listen, that's very excellent way of putting it. I like what you said, because to add on, I couldn't add nothing to that, because people like Miles Davis, he always kept a good accompanist, someone that could play the piano, that could comp. And then you find people like Art Tatum that would run all through you. I tell him, he be playing single notes while you playing, he playing single notes. And he wasn't really a comper. And but Bud Powell was a comper and could play single notes. And Bud Powell knew the horn player, and he started playing, let the horn player be free. Now, you couldn't play, you know, copying was very complicated. That's something very hard to do. That's how I learned how to do when I was coming up, is comp. And if you can comp correctly, you can comp and move the whole band. Comp, basically comp. And lots of piano players could comp. They play like Bud Powell, and Bud Powell could comp. But the comping that's very important. Very important. And sometimes you comp with drive, and Oscar Peterson comp, and he had a lot of drive when he comped. You know, he was comping, but he wasn't comping like you would say that ordinarily comping, but he comped with a lot of drive. And the piano player that followed Bud, they comped with the chords and the concept. And what the comper is supposed to do is push the band out in the front playing, and push the rhythm section, keep the rhythm section on time. So if you got that's one thing Miles always kept, was a good comper, good bass player, and a good drummer. But he always kept with somebody that could comp on that piano.
And he liked the people who comped and left space. Always,
yeah, but that's what's hard to do. Because most of them comping wouldn't need no space, and they didn't. And that's what I had to learn. That's what I learned to do was it wasn't playing all those notes. It you just be playing, but you be listening to the same. You have to listen to what they're doing, because they're telling a story, and you're supposed to blend in with the story that they're telling. Now, and if you're gonna overcome them with their story, it's gonna cause a problem. So what you want to do is not overcomp the story. You listen to the story, then you listen to the drummer, you listen to the bass player. That's the way I got it. And if you listen to all the rhythm section going, and then the horn, and then listen to the one out there playing the lead, and I don't care if nobody said, Miles Davis always got a good rhythm section, always.
Right. Yeah.
Because he had a.
I'm sorry.
He perhaps told the people what he wanted, you know.
Sure. To go back to those early days, we talked about Chris Anderson. Another musician who I believe was very much in Chicago at that time was Israel Crosby.
Oh, he was fantastic.
Can you talk about Israel Crosby, please, and what he meant at that time?
He played with Ahmed Jamal, but I met him when I was working with Tommy Jones. Tommy Jones was the tenor player in Chicago, and Israel Crosby he wasn't with Ahmed Jamal yet, but he has such original way of playing. He played in one position. He played all the notes in one position. He didn't walk all over the bass. He could play all the E flats and F sharps all in one position. Now that's pretty complicated to do, because I tell you why. Because musicians at that time, they were all over the bass, and being all over the bass, you got to drive the horn player. Then you want to be heard too. So the bass player wanted to be heard, but Israel Crosby, he just set the groove and set in that one position, and that's what he was just a fantastic bassist. He's one of my favorites of all times.
When I was talking with, when I interviewed my old friend Vernel Fournier, he said the first thing that the first thing that Israel told him on their first gig in 1949 was, he said, "You played too loud." And I and I find that listening to records on with Israel Crosby, he played at a relatively low volume, and it seemed as though he was at his best when things came down. Not to say that he couldn't drive like crazy, but that he had this concept on the bass that was not going to be plucking and slapping and loud.
Oh, no, he do all that. Yeah, no.
And he also said, and I'm curious how you react to this. He also said that Ahmad would come in, and I'm wondering if you had a similar experience. Ahmad would come in with a tune, and gradually as they played it, Israel Crosby's bass line would suggest a reharmonization. And, he'd just throw in a note here and a note there, and then all of a sudden the changes would change.
That's why they were so popular, and that's why they did so well, because they all listened. They listened. Israel was listening to the drummer. Can you imagine listening to what the drummer was playing? Well, he's the drummer, and the drummer listened to the piano player, and the piano player listened to the bass player. Everybody was listening to what everybody was doing, and that's how they got the story out there. Yeah. And Jamal was able to. Well, he was a swinger anyway.
Right.
He could swing that piano, and Israel was a swinger, and they just had a great time together. Now at the same time, there are people out there like Earl Hines, and
Teddy Wilson.
Oh, Teddy Wilson.
Nat Cole.
Nat Cole. How about
Chicago?
Teddy could comp, believe it or not.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
He could comp. Teddy Wilson could comp.
Yes.
He was a comper.
Yeah. Can you talk about the Cole family? Of course, the Coles were from Chicago, and I guess just when you were getting to be a teenager and stuff, the Nat Cole trio hit in a big way. Any insights into Eddie Cole or Freddie Cole or Ike Cole or?
That whole family, but it's about 6 of those brothers. There's a bunch of them. But Nat King Cole, he was an excellent pianist, because he and Prez did some things together. It was fantastic. And Nat King Cole, he could sing so well. He had perfect intonation. To me, he did, and he could sing, and he knew how to make people listen to what he was singing. I think by him singing so well, that just overshadowed his piano playing. But he could play the piano. But his singing was just, he and Oscar Moore, man, oh my goodness. And the bass player, King Cole's trio. I used to go to see them at Savoy Ballroom and just look at Oscar Moore.
And Oscar Moore in Chicago or the Savoy in New York?
No, in Chicago.
Right.
And that man played the piano. This one, Oscar Moore, played the chords on the guitar. Oscar Moore was a genius and the bass player. But Nat King Cole was an excellent pianist. But his singing just that did it for him.
That was such a popular format in the 40s, the piano, guitar, and bass. Even Art Tatum copied Nat Cole for a moment and got Tiny Grimes and Slam Stewart.
Yeah, he did. I just heard a record. A friend of mine just gave me I heard a record. Shaw, he bought a record by me with Art Tatum and Tiny Grimes and Slam Stewart. And believe me, they fit perfectly.
So in your early years, George, did you wind up working with in that format? And if you did, with whom?
Well, you know, my format has always been that, well, this, after I got into bebop, because around Chicago, mostly they had swing bands. They had trio work, but I didn't work too much with trios. And the guitar and the piano player singing and playing, and the bass player. I didn't go into that too much. I was into the hardcore, the drummer bashing on those drums.
Speaking of drummers bashing on drums, and I don't know whether he bashed or not, but I would love to hear you talk about Ike Day.
Ike Day?
Yes.
You said, I'm sorry, you said Ike Day?
Yes, I was wondering if you could share memories, thoughts about Ike Day, because he's someone who everyone talks about how Max Roach loved the way he played, and yet he only made a handful of records. So if you could tell us about Ike Day.
Well, I don't remember him making too many records at all, but Ike Day he had something that is pretty hard to get on drums. He made everything sound like a cushion. I mean, the cymbal never was too loud, the snare never was too loud, his foot never was too loud. He made everything just blend. You know, it was like cooking food or something, everything just blend. And even when he's solo, he never was, you know, like you're talking about being too loud. He never got too loud. He always was tasty, and he always had the drums at a level where the piano player could be heard. You know, some piano players, when they get to playing, they overshadow the instruments. They get to comping sometimes, and they overcomp. But Ike Day, I don't know if he told them that you're too loud or what. I don't know. I don't know about that, but he was very tasty. He was just a tasty drummer. And a young man, he was young. He was in his teens. But he never could settle down. And Max Roach used to come in Chicago and look at Ike. Now, at that time, Max Roach was playing bebop. And Ike Day was playing somewhat standard type drums. He wasn't current like Max Roach was, you know. But Ike Day was doing his thing. That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to play his way of playing, and he was very tasteful with it. And everybody loved Ike Day.
When you mentioned the way he played, it almost sounds like Denzel Best.
Denzel Best was another one. They had smooth. They didn't get too loud. They didn't overplay. But you know, but they kept the beat going. You know, they were smooth. They weren't trying to show out. I don't call it showing out, but sometimes the drums can be overbearing. It don't necessarily have to be drums. It could be anybody. It could be a bass player, guitar player, and piano player. Sometimes the person get carried away with themselves and stop listening and stop trying to blend in with the harmony. And Ike Day was the one that he just blend in. As if he was a young man. You know, but you know, at that time, you have to remember, you had big bands at that time. And big bands, you had to have a drummer that could play loud. You had a drummer that could play loud with his foot. Because at that time, the foot was the bass drum was in control. And they used their foot and he hit those 4/4 with the foot, and the bass player playing 4/4. But as time went on, they stopped playing 4/4 with their foot and it started using, well, they started kicking more or less. That was the change in the drums. It wasn't just a beat, but they started, they wanted to say something too. They wanted to say what they had to say. It just, the drums can be, it's an instrument, I knew that though, but the drum is like a singer or something. They can blend in and make it, but they listen.
You mentioned about overshadowing, so of course I have to ask about Shadow Wilson.
Yeah, well, I worked opposite Shadow Wilson. He was working with Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald. I was working down with Johnny Griffin, and he was playing with Ella Fitzgerald, and they gave him a solo. He had been playing brushes for so long. And so it's pretty hard for him to take a solo because he'd been playing brushes so long. But he was smooth man with the brushes.
When we hear you on record in those days, and on that famous live recording with Bird and the others, you're so original that sound like no one else that I almost don't know how you'll answer this question. Were there any guitar players of your time, of your generation, who you enjoyed for their originality, or with whom you had a friendship or talk shop, or were you kind of pretty much up on your own plane because you're listening more to the horn players? Were the guitar players that you felt a kinship with or had a relationship with in your early days?
Well, you know what? I want to thank you for saying that. That really made me, you really made my day. You really made my day. Now, if you want to have a day made, you made mine. And that's, at that time, guitar players were, they, as I told you, I come up in Chicago, where you had a big ballrooms, like the Persian ballroom and Parkway ballroom. And you get in these ballrooms and the kids come out, and the kids want to dance. That's what they want. That's what they come there to dance. They come there to dance. Now, even though they come there to dance, when Charlie Parker got out there with his music, they come to listen. So the guitar players at that time, they were more or less into George Sherry. He had a hell of a good guitar player with him. George Sherry and Oscar Moore, Nat King Cole, Tiny Grimes. They had lots of guitar players out there playing. And then, but when the bebop came in, the guitar players kind of went out and started doing their own thing and started playing hard. Not hard. Bonnie Castle was a hard player. Bonnie Castle would play the guitar hard. And then you had Kenny Burrell, he played hard. And I can't say Grant Green played hard because he didn't have to play hard because he played so many beautiful notes until he didn't have to play hard.
But were there any that you had were there any back in your earlier days that you actually had the chance? I mean, it's different with saxophones or on a gig. There might be 2 saxophones. There might be 3 trombones on a gig. Usually there was only 1 guitar. But did you have the chance to actually work with another guitar or hang out with them in Chicago and talk shop, or were you pretty much on your own?
Oh yeah, that's how I learned. Like I was telling you before, this guitar player lived across the street from me. I met him. Mm-hmm. And oh God, we used to play every day, all day, every day. In fact, Mike Manna, I'm sorry.
Do you remember his name, George? I know it's a long time ago.
John Goodlow was his name.
Okay.
All of the guitar players. We used to practice. We used to play every day. We lived across the street from each other. And he's the one that taught me how to play on the bass strings. And lots of guitar players play on the top 3 strings, which is good,
right?
Yeah, I'm not complaining about that, but it's the idea. I met the man that taught me how to play on the bass strings.
Sure.
In other words, you got six strings, so he tell me you got to play them those strings too.
Sure. That seems like a sudden cutoff of our interview with George Freeman. This is just the first of a 3-part series of interviews, again, with this legendary guitarist. Harlem Speaks is our oral history program at the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. The museum offers many programs, some historical, some interviews, many on contemporary issues that intersect in many and surprising ways with jazz. My name is Lauren Schoenberg. I'm the senior scholar at the museum. You can find out more about what we offer at our website, www.jmih.org, at our Facebook page, also on our YouTube channel, where many of these interviews ultimately live. On behalf of the staff, our board, our volunteers, everyone at the museum, we want to thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again.